Hello fellow fans of the TI-99. Time to take a look at the latest reason Rasmus is the hero 99ers need. With today's reason on that front being his Zaxxon arcade port. That started out as a series of demos in spring 2021, but those turned pretty quickly into a full-fledged port of the Zaxxon arcade game. Zaxxon has a pretty long and complicated history on the TI-99, especially for a game that never really came to the platform in the first place. I've talked about all that history before on this channel, and I've gone into the details of how Zaxxon kind of eventually happened on the TI-99 as the Zaxxon clone Arcturus in 1984. Arcturus is really more of a Zaxxon-inspired isometric shooter than a Zaxxon port per se. Still, it's as close as the TI-99 got in the 1980s. Until Rasmus's new Zaxxon project, there's never really been a TI Zaxxon clone that tries to deliver exactly what an arcade Zaxxon fan would be after. In the arcade, Zaxxon was of course a 1982 isometric shooter from Sega. It scrolls diagonally, it's got tons of big colorful sprites and sprite animations, and all that action's going on in 3 dimensions. The game's first phase of play has you flying through a space fortress, trying to destroy enemies and trying to keep your ship fueled by blowing up fuel drums? Not sure that last part makes much sense, but it is what it is. Anyway, the second phase of play has you flying through space itself, trying to destroy enemy flyers and survive the chaos out there. And then finally, once you've gotten through there, if you've gotten through there, a third phase of play has you flying through another fortress, this time with more obstacles in your way, and with a battle with a giant robot at the end. So on a system like the TI-99, clearly, this is just way too much to ask. On a platform where scrolling and sprite motion are done in software, and where all those graphical assets sit in a VDP memory area that the CPU can't touch. But lots of other 80s platforms were in the same situation using that same popular 9918 VDP, and a bunch of those platforms did get Zaxxon ports. So, as far as the struggle to make Zaxxon happen on a 9918 VDP, well, the TI-99 was never alone at all. ColecoVision was one of the platforms that saw a decent early 80s attempt to make the game happen on a system with the same graphics hardware and the same sound chip as the TI-99. And I think the ColecoVision port does a really good job at what it's trying to do. It barely tries at all to look like the arcade version. But I think the decision to throw in the towel on that front was probably for the best. Because it's really impressively playable as a consequence. Responsive controls the whole time, and the scrolling's fast enough that it doesn't feel like a slideshow. And I guess I'm not alone in thinking this version's worth playing and this version's worth imitating, since that version also later got ported to MSX over in Europe by Electric Dream Software out of the UK. So MSX users had an appealing option in that version too. Elsewhere in Japan, Sega's SG-1000 got a completely different port. And despite working with the same video hardware, this one really isn't up to the standard of the ColecoVision version in my opinion, at least as far as gameplay goes. Which, for me, I think is probably the most important thing. Controls clunkier, and scrolling and ship motion are really noticeably slower. It does have more detailed backgrounds going for it though, and it is more arcade accurate for sure. But that just doesn't make up for the actual gameplay being worse all around. The SG-1000 version also got ported to MSX in Japan, so Japanese users got to suffer through this kind of unfortunate attempt at Zaxxon on 2 platforms, MSX and SG-1000 both. The upshot of that being, in the long run, MSX users got 2 Zaxxon ports to choose from. Ports from 2 different spins on making Zaxxon happen on a system with the same sound and same graphics hardware as a TI-99. I think they make for a pretty cool contrast as far as laying out your options go. The ColecoVision version's more interested in making the best Zaxxon-like game that, despite all the challenges, plays alright on a 9918. While the SG-1000 games more interested in cloning the arcade design as well as you can under the circumstances, even if that means you get in the bargain a kind of clunky Zaxxon-flavored slideshow. Arcturus delivered something more like the prior option on the TI-99, a Zaxxon-style game that plays as well as a Zaxxon game can on 80s TI-99 hardware. The design was pretty hugely different from arcade Zaxxon, so definitely not a game going for the arcade game's look and feel the way the SG-1000 game does, but worthwhile in its own right. So for a very long time, what the TI-99's been missing is something more like the SG-1000 and Japanese MSX versions of Zaxxon. Versions that squeeze as much arcade Zaxxon out of a TI VDP as that chip architecture is ever going to let you. Back in the early 80s, Datasoft bought the home computer rights for Zaxxon, and they'd promised a TI-99 version. But they never delivered on it, so we've had to wait until now to see what a real Zaxxon port for TI-99 looks like. But I figure it was worth the wait. And one reason it was worth waiting is the hardware we have today to do it with. If we were still working with the same TI hardware we had when all the other Zaxxon ports came out in the 80s, we'd probably just have a port along the lines of Sega's Zaxxon remake for SG-1000. And it might even sound the same, given the sound chips shared in common too. But naturally, we've been tweaking the TI-99 over the years, and the F-18A VDP is the big graphics upgrade that's taken the TI-99 to the next level lately, giving us new paletting options and more sprites per scan line, and a whole lot else besides. And Rasmus's Zaxxon port takes advantage of all of that to do a whole lot better than you could have done on a vanilla 9918A. So Rasmus's Zaxxon port does require the F-18A, and you're going to need one if you want to play it on real iron. But if you haven't got that, you're not completely shut out of the TI-99 Zaxxon experience, since you can still play it emulated on Rasmus's JS99er emulator at js99er.net. So yeah, making Zaxxon happen on an F-18A is definitely not the same thing as making it happen on a stock TI-99 with its original VDP. But computers should always be improving themselves, even the old ones. And the F-18A is one of the most popular ways to improve the TI-99 today. One more 80s era upgrade that you'll need to play this Zaxxon port is the 32K memory expansion. But that's not just something you need for this game. For just about any TI-99 related purpose at all, that upgrade's a must-have. Without the 32K, the TI-99 is a system with 256 bytes of RAM that the CPU can actually address. So a TI-99 very much needs its 32K. But happily these days, that's easily available as a cheap sidecar. So even if you don't have a peripheral expansion box for card expansion, you can get your 32K easily at minimal cost. But anyway, back to the game. Just how accurate is it? Well, graphically anyway, it's pretty much arcade perfect. Compare the arcade version to the TI-99 version side by side, and as you can see, it's the same damn game. But just to get picky, there are a few differences. One big one is the altimeter, the bar on the left that shows you how high or low you're flying. You can see in the arcade version it has a per pixel gradation, with some hash marks to help you tell where you are in the tracking. On the TI-99 version, on the other hand, we've got a 16-bar scale that looks pretty different. And personally, I think I would have been happier with something more like the arcade original. You can see in the ColecoVision version what that might look like in 9918 graphics. Another little difference is what happens when you die. In the arcade version, the screen blacks out like this, and you get a little explosion animation. Whereas in the TI-99 version, there's just a little explosion at your current location. Then the game restarts. And in this case, I actually like this change. I find that business of blacking out the screen for an explosion animation pretty oddly disruptive and unnecessary. Maybe a Zaxxon superfan would say that's just how it's supposed to be. But, well, I'm happy to do away with that and have the explosion happen where it actually happened instead. Other differences I notice are mostly timing issues, and they aren't really either good or bad unless you really want the arcade gameplay exactly as it is. Missiles move a lot faster on the TI-99 version, and laser turret shots move slower for 2. But as I say, there's no right answer here. There's no speed that any missile just always ought to move at, unless you'll stand for nothing less than replicating everything exactly as it was in arcade Zaxxon. In which case, well, write a strongly worded letter to Rasmus in the development thread on Atari Age, so everyone can have a good laugh. But I guess the ultimate question is ZQX-ONE fun? Well, it almost seems weird to talk about how much fun an arcade port is when it's as accurate as this one is to the original. ZQX-ONE stands on the merits of the original game, for better or worse. However much fun it is, it's pretty much completely on the arcade Zaxxon. So if you find Zaxxon frustrating, you'll definitely find this port just as frustrating in pretty much the same way. If you think Zaxxon's got awesome looks going for it, well, you'll enjoy those same looks here, because that's changed pretty much not at all. I do think Zaxxon, or ZQX-ONE in this case, is a neat challenge, even today. It was loved in its own time for doing something cool and fresh and new, and amazingly, it's still a pretty fresh design today, since it's not a design that's been endlessly copied over the years. By the time the tech was there to make a scrolling isometric shooter like this one play well on home systems, we just weren't really all that interested in doing it anymore. So, isometric scrolling shooters just never really got the opportunity to be a used-up, played-out genre. By the time Sega released Zaxxon 3D in 1988, it wasn't even an isometric game anymore. It was a rail shooter like Space Harrier. Though, as a fan of the Sega 3D glasses, I will say it's a pretty cool game. And there are maybe some good reasons for giving up on isometric action in the long run. Control in Zaxxon can be pretty confusing, especially at first. But the game gives you all the tools you need to get past that if you're willing to give it a shot. So most people will get comfortable with it if they give it a chance. You've got your altimeter to show you your elevation naturally on the left, and you've got your ship shadow to tell you where your ship is laterally with reference to the ground. So you've got what you need to tell exactly where you are in 3 dimensions at all times. That just gets a little harder in the open space sequences, where you haven't got your ship's shadow to help you out. In those, I'm pretty much just trying to stay alive the whole time, either in the arcade version or the TI-99 one. I'm glad Rasmus's Zaxxon port is an F-18A game. If it had been a game for the classic 9918A, we'd miss out on all this arcade-perfect Zaxxon gameplay. But I'm also kind of glad for this game being an F-18A game, because that means Arcturus can still reign supreme as the best Zaxxon clone for the original 80s TI-99 hardware. So they've both still got their niche on the platform. ZQX-ONE as the perfect port for the latest in TI-99 tech. Arcturus as the classic clone for the original 80s hardware. Thanks for watching, folks. If you're a TI-99 fan or a Zaxxon fan or any combination of those two things, then you need to give ZQX-ONE a try, either on your F-18A modded TI-99 or on JS99er.net otherwise. I'll close this one out with a full cycle of the game, though, so regardless, you can see everything there is to see in TI-99 Zaxxon. Won't take long, a full cycle of the game only lasts a couple minutes. After that, the cycle repeats. See you next time.